Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Olivia, for that wonderful presentation of Gyalwar Rinpoche's visit. In terms of opening the way for the coming of the Christ and the connection of that spiritual impetus with the Maitreya mythology, I thought that perhaps a few perspectives, both from the point of Buddhist spiritual thinking or philosophical thinking, and also from the perspective of Buddhist art, may help. Those of you who know me here, and I've been through Phoenix several times over the last years, know that for the better part of a half decade I was engaged in trying to rebuild the house in Mongolia where the great mystical artist Nicholas Roerich lived and painted in 1926 and 27. For that reason, I put this painting by him as my opening image. Actually, I changed it about 10 times today, what I would use for the opening one. But I thought this is, in many ways, captures spiritually and artistically what is the intent behind this sort of mystical tradition, the coming of the Christ, the coming of the Maitreya. Nicholas Roerich did this painting, I think, in 1936. And the star of the hero here being the Bodhisattva. When Nicholas Roerich went to Tibet in 1927 and 1928, his intention was to have the Dalai Lama sort of internationally recognized at that time as the spiritual head of Buddhism in Asia, and have himself recognized as kind of a spearhead for the Bodhisattva tradition in the West. That's clear from notes and journals and other writings. But he didn't like to use too much technical jargon. I mean, in the 1920s, words like Bodhisattva, even Buddha, weren't part of the English language like they are today. So he used the word the hero. But to show his intent, he puts casts the painting in Ladakh and in front of a Buddhist monastery with a Buddhist monk sitting in front. And by the way, in terms of raising money for the house Roerich House in Mongolia, Olivia Hansen helped with that with moral encouragement, and she came to Mongolia and visited and broke a leg there. So when I came up to give my talk this evening, she said, "Go ahead, break a leg." And I said, "No need for me to do that, you've already done it." And I have a wonderful photo of her sitting in front of the Roerich House with her leg in a cast. I wanted to include this. The woman in the picture is Risa Wallace, who is the daughter of Vice President Henry Wallace. And he was a student of Roerich back in the day, as the word goes. And this is the original study for the painting of Star of the Hero that at the time was not yet created. I don't know if you guys know much about Roerich's painting technique. He was a great theosophist, a great seven rays person, and a great thinker in general, spiritual mover and social mover in general. But he gave this painting to Vice President Henry Wallace. Well, at the time I think he was Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, in 1927. And so it predates the actual great painting that I think is amongst Roerich's best works. And I happened to be in Washington, D.C., giving a talk on Roerich to a group of peoples organized by the daughter of a senator friend of mine, whom Olivia also knows. And Raisa came to it and said, "Oh, I've got a couple of paintings that Roerich gave my dad." And I was very, very amazed to see that one of them was the original study for Star of the Harrow. That's, for me, Roerich's greatest work. And Roerich was really the one who brought to the West, in a kind of a vast way, a non-denominational or non-border oriented, a borderless, barefoot doctors without border, barefoot spiritual doctors without borders kind of manner. The way he brought over the stories of Shambhala, Maitreya, and he tied the many traditions of the world together. Of course, it's very much suggested by the logo that he later used, Pax Cultura, peace through spiritual culture. And he tried to bring that with his paintings and with all of his other aspects of his work. But it was for me just very amazing to learn that his greatest painting had actually been a study that he gave to our vice president over here, your vice president. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace became Vice President Henry Wallace. Roerich was sponsored by Eleanor Roosevelt's mother, and until Roosevelt passed away, he kept a bust of Roerich on his office, on his table in the Oval Office. 1935, he signed the Roerich Peace Pact into law, that when America got in wars with anyone, and they signed with 25 other countries around the world, they wouldn't shoot any artists. Nicholas Roerich wasn't biased, but also no philosophers, no spiritual teachers, no bombing of museums and libraries, no arresting and shooting professors and so forth. So it was kind of and that was later used by Eleanor Roosevelt as a model for the Declaration of Human Rights, that she modeled it on Roerich's Peace Pact. And he was, of course, the first Buddhist to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And he probably did about 200 paintings. He did 7,000 all told, but about 200 inspired by the Maitreya mythology, if you will, and using mythology in the sense of deep spiritual legacy transmitted by ways of stories and art and allegory. Here, 1925-26, so this is when he left India to go up to Mongolia and then down through Tibet. His great wish, of course, at the time was that to unite all the so-called Lamaist countries from Buryat and Tuva of eastern Russia through the Mongol kingdoms, down through Tibet, through all of the Himalayas of North India, to try to get them to unite into one country and become a kind of a zone of peace as a sort of a model for how human civilization could live on a sustainable way. In Tibet, even though sometimes the communist caste the lamas and the aristocrats as very wealthy and the farmers as very poor, there was rarely more than 3 times distance between the lowest and the highest income. And it was a very sustainable way of life. And here he used the words Maitreya the Conqueror, the word Chinna in Sanskrit, he's translating, or Gyalwa, no, what is it? Gyalwa, yeah, in Tibetan. And conqueror there meaning conquered of the inner delusions of avidya, or the ignorance of not knowing the nature of the self, and just general inner darkness clouding the divine spirit which is within everyone, and the klesha of anger, hatred, and its opposites, fear and so forth, and jealousy. And then the great delusion of attachments and addictions and self-complacency and so on. So he must have seen this. He doesn't say, or we don't know, unfortunately, after the Roerich house that was built for him in New York, 24-story building, after it failed in the Great Depression and was sold off. So many of the notes and journals about so much of his work, actually, if someone didn't come and personally cart them away, were just put out in the backyard to be carted away. But he must have seen this traveling through Ladakh and down the other side and into the Buddhist regions of Russia. And this one he painted later in 1937. So this is when he's living back in India. But again, it would be a sort of a handmade, almost, well, a very natural stone henge kind of creation with enormous boulders, and inside of it, a very simply carved Maitreya Buddha. Then moving on to Shambhala, because I think in Roerich's mind and in the mind of many of the Western mystics of the time, there was a connection between the Maitreya prophecies and the Shambhala prophecies. So this is one of my favorite of his Shambhala set of paintings, and again, he made about 100 of them. This is called Song of Shambhala. And it has to do a little bit with history, but essentially he's sitting looking across the Black Gobi as he leaves Mongolia and looking toward Tibet, across what's known as the Black Gobi, the Har Gobi, towards what he thought was the sacred place of Shambhala. It's kind of an interesting, because actually, as we'll see in a later painting, there's 97 Shambhalas, a main one and 96 minor ones. But this one is kind of interesting, and it's on the old camel route, going from olden day Urga, or Ulaanbaatar in today's world, or Daharam back in the old days, Dahore in the old days, that went from the center of Mongolia down to Tibet. And right past this area, people used to always see flying saucers. And so when he was going through on that time, there were a number of sightings. Also, when the 13th Dalai Lama, about 30 years earlier, or 34 years earlier, traveled from Tibet to Mongolia, going the opposite way on the same route, he pointed out that that was thought by Tibetans to be one of the main, I think 4 main ones of the 96 Shambhala sacred sites. And again, often historically, there were many UFO sightings there. And amazingly, some of the oldest human remains archaeologically have come up there of humanoids without, walking on us sacred bipeds. But anyway, the 13th Dalai Lama in 1909 pointed to the same area and said, this is one of the strongest Shambhala sites. And locally, again, there were many stories of sort of unidentified flying objects. Roerich did a whole set of paintings of the king of Shambhala. Now, the difference between Maitreya and the kings of Shambhala is, of course, Maitreya is a sort of a monk, becomes a monk-style and Bodhisattva-style teacher, whereas the kings of Shambhala do the same job, but in a secular way. And the Tibetan name for that is Rigden Drakpo, or wrathful, the wrathful knowledge holders. And this is one of the Rigden Drakpo the only one that of Roerich's 7,000 paintings that he left in Mongolia when he left, largely because he was under contract to the New York billionaire who had stored who had built the 24-story building for him and had contracted that every painting must come to the museum. The idea of the Shambhala king as kind of a tough guy bringing the world to peace through tough means. And Maitreya, on the other hand, brings the world to peace by means of gentle means. And those two mythologies exist simultaneously in the same cultures of India, and then, of course, all of the Himalayan regions, all of Eastern Russia, Mongolia. and so forth. And for Nicholas Roerich, there was not a contradiction between those two. One of the reasons why I really liked him a lot was he refused to travel without a gun, even though he was a man of peace and his logo was peace through culture. Because he said, you're always going to come across some uncultured types who won't get it. And so when he was going across the Silk Road through Urumqi, and they tried to disarm him, the local governor said, we hear you have 2 trunkloads of guns and you're not allowed to carry them through. And he said, sorry about that, but we are going to carry them through. Because without them, we will be toast. And I always like that side about him, because so often you get philosophers and spiritualists and social thinkers and so forth who don't really take into account the brutality of certain kinds of people on the planet. And, everyone can take their own opinions on those things, but for me, that's an endearing feature of him. But then I'm Irish Protestant. We always like someone who stands up for his own. And in Tibet, of course, it was very important. In fact, in Tibet, every household was expected to be self-defending, to apply to the police or the army to help against thieves or bandits was considered to be a kind of an appeal for welfare, that you really should be able to manage your own affairs in that regard. Otherwise, it's a bad sign of your social stability, really. Of course, that doesn't really work in really highly populated areas because bullets fly indiscriminately. But in the open spaces of Tibet, it worked. So this is the Shambhala image and the Shambhala prophecy. There's the kingdom of Shambhala in the ball with the 96 sacred Shambhala sites and the main sacred Shambhala site at the center. And streaming out from Shambhala, this little army of horsemen. And according to the prophecy in the Shambhala and the Kalachakra Tantras, then sometime in the next few generations, the world's going to have a little bit of a confrontation. We don't know if it'll be a physical one or a spiritual one or an intellectual one or a moral one or a military one. That's not really stated very clearly. It could be any of those forces. But when it happens, essentially, the world, if it goes in a positive direction, it has a positive outcome, then the world goes in a golden age for 1,000 years. And if it has the dark side wins, then we have a dark age for 1,000 years. And therefore, in the Buddhist world, as in so many spiritual traditions around the world that are connected with those ancient prophecies, those of us who are on the planet today, our main job is to open the way for that golden age, to bring in the conditions for that golden age. And I think if we look at it, even without thinking of the military side or nuclear sides, those kind of things, we look at it just in terms of social sort of 1984 George Orwellian sort of situations. Right now, the distance between the very, very rich and the very, very poor has gotten something almost bordering on unbearable barbarism. There's not much more you can say about it, that 5 or 10% of the planet lives very, very well, and the other 80, 90%, they're not sure if they can feed their kids. And of course, there's social issues behind that and economic factors behind that and whatnot. But those aren't the main issues we're looking at in today's world. We're not paying attention to how to bring a golden age for everyone on the planet for 1,000 years. So, and this is another painting of that same nature with Shambhala here. And the name for Shambhala in Tibetan literally means place of peace. Sham is the same word as in shamatha, like in a meditation where you do completely unmoving, restful meditation, silent, with the mind not scattering away to something and not falling asleep. And so place of peace. In other words, Shambhala represents a kind of the earth as a paradisical lifestyle, where humans finally figure out how to live in peace with one another and in a sustainable lifestyle that not only humans but all other living beings on the planet are equally accepted and treated with equal dignity. Naturally, dogs will still eat the occasional cat, and cats will eat the occasional birds, and from time to time a spider will hop on a fly. There's not much we can do about those kind of things. But what we can do as humans is create a spiritual lifestyle where humans are born, they live a growth-orientated life, a spiritually growth-orientated life in relative peace, relative happiness. Often the Dalai Lama says the biggest problem with humans is they walk around poking themselves in the eye with their own finger and saying, oh my goodness, I've got such a sore eye. This world is such a terrible place. Now I've got two sore eyes. And in a way it's like that, isn't it? It's not hard to see how humans could learn to live in gentleness, in love, in kindness, and in harmony with the elements, in basic harmony with one another. Why can't we? Quite simple. Ignorance, anger, hatred, and greed, desire. What we call the three great spiritual poisons, or psychic poisons, or mind poisons. And because of that, ignorance causes us to live out of harmony, anger causes us to live in conflict, and desire causes us to always want more, more, more. As a Buddha put it, a small drop of oil on a paper soon spreads out and covers the whole paper. And in that way, if we let the mind of discontent take over our life, it doesn't matter what we have, how much we have, we still suffer from discontent. And at the bottom, the army of Shambhala rushes out. So according to the prophecy, the forces of darkness and the forces of light are sort of like 49.5%, 49.5%. And the forces of goodness rush out from Shambhala. And the 49.5 become 50.5. And the golden age comes in for 1,000 years. So by that prophecy, it really means that what people who take these kind of ancient prophecies seriously and who think they can make a difference, it's really not working with having to try to change the 49.5 or the 51.5. It really comes down to trying to transform the consciousness of that 1%. That if that 1% that tilts, it's like a few years ago, Olivia gave me a book and said, you have to read this. It's called The Tipping Point. I think it's because when I'd taken her to Tibet, I was skinny, and when I took her to Mongolia, I was a little chubbier. So I think it was really a hint on diet. But I didn't take it that way. I took it as part of the Shambhala prophecies. So the 49.5 and the 49.5 is that 1%, which is the tipping point. And that's why sometimes when I travel and teach, sometimes in some cities there's 5 people or 10 people, sometimes there's 50 people or 100 people, sometimes there's a few hundred people, sometimes more. And I always tell people, numbers are not what counts here. It really is that 1% of the planet that tips the balance between ignorance, hatred, and greed, and the wish to live in peace, harmony, joy, contentment, and so forth. And the 49.5% on either side are always going to remain somewhat lethargical about issues, in my mind, in my thinking. And it's really that 1% or 2% or whatever it is in the middle that really will make the difference. because humans are a gregarious sponge. If we look back over history, we see that if we get good leadership, we get a good society. We get bad leadership, we get bad society. We get good spiritual teachers, we get good spiritual results. We have false spiritual teachers, and we get negative spiritual results. And we can see that in every religious tradition of the world. From in Christianity, we've seen many great teachers who've done great things, and we see nutcases. Now, the point of Maitreya, or the Buddhist take on Maitreya, and of course, you know, if we look at the way Roerich talks about it, or Blavatsky talks about it, or any of the early theosophical and theosophically inspired movements talk about it, naturally, they're contextualizing it and using a language which is meaningful to the people they're talking to. Because as I said in my talk this afternoon, words are but a finger pointing at the moon. And if you say something that nobody understands, then it doesn't really help anyone, even though what you say is completely true. So it's the same in the Asian tradition. So when they speak in these kind of terms, it's purely in the context of their own listeners. But according to that idea, we live in something called the Bhadra Kalpa, the auspicious eon. And in this auspicious eon, there are 1,000 masters who become universal teachers. And each of those, their lineages last for 5,000 years. Buddhists always round up to the nearest 5,000. So that probably lasts for, 4,999. Or maybe 5,001. And between them, humanity goes into a kind of a doldrums for a while. And they're not Buddhist in a religious sense. As I mentioned in this afternoon, Nagarjuna's statement, on every atom, there's 100 Buddhas all trying to talk to you. So every atom of your body has all these enlightened beings saying, hey, Glenn, you just made a mistake. Would you mind correcting? When I give talks, I have to turn them off. I turn down their volume controller. It really gets too much sometimes. You know the feeling? But anyway, these 1,000, between these 1,000, of course, they bring many, many thousands to enlightenment. What's special about these 1,000 is that they have legacies that last for several thousand years and bring many, many thousands to enlightenment. So you could say they're kind of special amongst equals in that everyone who's a Buddha has the same qualities of realization, the same qualities of wisdom, the same qualities of love, and so forth. It doesn't matter in Buddhist way of thinking if they lived in Timbuktu or if they lived in Tipperary. They will have the same qualities of realization and of wisdom, of love, compassion, insight, and so forth. What they may differ slightly in is their teaching karma, how vast an audience they will reach and how long their lineage will last. Therefore, some masters teach and have tens of thousands of people coming to listen to them, and others teach and just a few people come. Some teach and a few people come, and then those few people have thousands of people who come. So the difference is kind of the karma in an immediate teaching way. So these 1,000 are only special in terms of their teachings. And so this is a set of tankas. Probably I didn't count the number in there, but Olivia is very good at mathematics, so I'm sure she's counted. We can just ask her how many were there, Olivia, how many? But it would have been a set of probably 25 tankas, and that would have had 1,000 Buddhas in it, of which Buddha Shakyamuni is said to have been the fourth. 2,500 years ago, or now 2,569 years ago. And the next having that karma will be Buddha Maitreya. And so Buddha Maitreya in Buddhist thinking is already a Buddha. So this is a painting that you often see this in Tibetan temples, the Buddha of the past, the Buddha of the present, and the Buddha of the future. In other words, the one who lived maybe 20,000 years ago and the present one and the one who will live Maitreya whenever he happens to be in a good mood and come dancing down the path to Tipperary. Often he's painted in this form, sitting on a throne and with a stupa on his head. The stupa is to represent that when Buddha passed away, he took some ashes from the funeral pyre and put them in the little stupa. In ancient times, a stupa was essentially a burial ground, a sacred burial ground, used for beings who had achieved enlightenment or high spiritual states. So he's often depicted like that, sometimes as a monk, sometimes like this as a bodhisattva. Now, the difference between a Buddha and a bodhisattva is that all Buddhas are bodhisattvas, but not all bodhisattvas are yet Buddhas. In Tibetan debate form, it's so called a musum, a three-pointed relationship. If you have a Buddha, you definitely have a bodhisattva. If you have a bodhisattva, you may not have a Buddha. And there is something which is neither Buddha nor bodhisattva. And he wears a deer skin. And the deer in Buddhism is sort of a symbol of gentleness and love and nonviolence and those kind of qualities. And dressed in bodhisattva robes rather than monk's robes, because a monk has a very particular lifestyle. They take 253 vows of things not to do, whereas a bodhisattva doesn't vow not to do anything. A bodhisattva takes 2 vows. The first vow is, I vow out of compassion for all living beings to try to quickly achieve enlightenment so as to be able to be wise enough to know how to benefit others. Because often we think we're benefiting someone and we're not, isn't it? We just sort of confuse them. And always getting letters, because I travel and teach 7 or 8 months a year, I'm always getting emails asking for advice, and I'm always saying, uh-oh, will this help or will this hurt? Because good advice can be useful. But on the other hand, sometimes it can also just not get the person out of thinking through their own problems and solving their own problems, can't it? So in order to really be able to benefit others, we need to have a deeper level of enlightenment. The great Atisha, whom I mentioned in my afternoon talk as being the sort of very great, wonderful, spontaneous poet and teacher of the 11th century, in one of his books he said, if you want to be of benefit to other beings, please try to quickly generate clairvoyance. Because by means of the power of clairvoyance, you can bring the benefits of 100 years into a single day. Without clairvoyance, you're like a blind man walking around trying to save other blind people. But with clairvoyance, you'll be able to help benefit others in very profound ways rather than in very superficial ways. And I think that's often what we do, isn't it? We often just help a person with one little symptomatic problem, whereas we don't touch to the root of the problem. So Asanga gives that. So I thought then to tell a little bit of a story about Maitreya, Buddha, and so on. So this is a painting of the Buddha Shakyamuni, who died 2,569 years ago. Below is Maitreya on the left, and another Bodhisattva, Manjusri, on the right. I'm going to skip. Oh no, I can go back. I had one more painting which in there, which had all 8 great Bodhisattvas. But generally, when we talk about the Maitreya and these kind of images or ideas, there's 3 kinds of explanations: outer, inner, and secret. And on the outer level, then the 8 great bodhisattvas who surround the Buddha in many paintings, bodhisattva disciples. On the outer level, they represent spiritual practices, spiritual qualities, something like that. and they also represent certain kind of philosophical approaches to spiritual ideas. You could say something like that, I think. On an inner level, they represent the 8 qualities of enlightenment that we need to become, we need to bring to fruition in order to become a Buddha ourselves, a fully enlightened being ourselves. On the outer level, the 8 are also kind of like archangels, you could say. They play across the centuries and across the millenniums. And they come and go and do mysterious things whenever those mysterious things are required. For instance, many of the great beings who are channeled by the mystics of different centuries are in fact those 8 great archangels. You could say something like that. It's the Buddhist understanding. Then I want to come down to this story, which is a little bit of a sad story, a tragic story, but with a happy ending. And it's okay if you have a sad story and a tragic story, so long as it has a happy ending, right? So this is to do with Maitreya and Manjushri. Those two are considered special amongst the 8. Because they are the main ones connected to the teaching karma of a Buddha. So for instance, any teacher, the 8 qualities that any teacher has, these 2 represent that given teacher's teaching potential and teaching success. So why did the Buddha succeed? Why was it that the Buddha became one of the 1,000 specials amongst equals? It has to do with a tiger and 5 cubs. Now, it's a very famous story. This is from a previous life, a Jataka of the Buddha. He's walking through the forest with his 2 brothers, and he's the youngest of the 3, and they come across a tigress, and she's with 5 cubs, and she's starving to death. And then the 3 look at her and say, oh my goodness, she's starving to death, so she's eventually going to have to, she doesn't even have enough energy to feed her cubs. She doesn't have enough energy to get up and hunt or move. Eventually she's going to have to eat her cubs in order to survive. And 2 of the brothers said okay to that. The 2 of them, they all were very upset about it. But, what are you going to do? There's nothing to feed it. And so they didn't come up with an answer. And so the 3 of them went back to the palace. And an hour later, one of the 3 went back to the forest. And then in his hand, you can see he took a stick. He broke off a dry stick. And then he took it on his arm and he cut a little cut on his arm vein, and he feeds some blood to the tigress. And then he made another little cut here, and he drips that into the tigress's mouth. And then slowly he feeds himself to the tigress. And so that's the sad start of the story. And then in the palace, the mother is asleep, and she dreams that her breasts start to swell and release milk, but then from the milk then the milk stops and turns to blood. And she has other unfortunate dreams like that, or dreams of misfortune. And she wakes up very nervous that something has happened to one of her 3 sons, so she runs out of the palace and wakes the king and says, we have to check on the 3 princes. I think something terrible has happened. I had a dream of milk coming from my breasts and turning to blood. And they see that, then the 2 boys come and say, well, we went to the forest and now where's the young prince? He's not here. And so then they all panic and they start, oh, he must have gone back to feed the tigress. This can be dangerous. So they run back to the forest, and there they find the tigress and the 5 cubs have left. And there's just bits of hair there and a bit of bone there and another bit of hair and another bit of bone there. And the story is told in a very wonderful, poetic way, especially in a sutra known as the Serudgido, or the Altangeral in Mongolian, Surumgama in Sanskrit, in which the mother sort of rolls on the ground crying in anguish, and the father rolls on the ground crying in anguish. And I think it tells something of the story of sacrifice. And for instance, if we think of Christ and the crucifixion and the sacrifice of crucifixion, sometimes we think about it only from his side, don't we? We often don't think, well, how did his brothers feel about that whole thing? He had 3 brothers. I'm like, obviously it wasn't a very happy day for them. How did his mother take it? And often we forget that in the sacrifices that everyone has to make in their life, it's not always easy for everyone around them. And it's told in a very beautiful way. And then the story ends up, and then the king says, well, I'd better get myself together here, because if I don't get myself together, the queen's not going to get herself together. If the queen doesn't get herself together, my 2 surviving sons won't get themselves together. And so he rushes back to the palace and goes to the queen and says, well, my queen, obviously our son decided to do that, and we have to accept it and get on with our lives. And please remember, we had 3 sons. The glass is still 2/3 full. And if you don't get your emotions together, they won't get their emotions together, and we could lose all 3 sons. And so as a result, the mother sort of gets out of bed and stops crying and goes down and talks to the 2 boys and gives them hugs and kisses, and they get on with their life and they live a happy, successful life. And so then the story ends that the story actually begins with Buddha and Ananda walking through a park in the mountains of Nepal, and Buddha says, oh, let's stop here. This just reminded me of something. And he touches the earth, and a stupa comes up. And in the stupa, then he says, this stupa has the bones from that boy. And so that's the boy that was eaten by the tiger in that time. And then the story ends basically with the boy, with Buddha saying, now, as for the people in this, the king and queen were reborn as my own mother and father in this lifetime. And so the king and queen, who were the mother of Bodhisattva at that time, were my own mother and father in this lifetime. Now, 7 days after Buddha was born, his mother passed away, presumably from postnatal related complications. It's not put that way in the Buddhist scriptures. It said the merit of giving birth to a Buddha can be so great that sometimes just that it's like eating too much cake with too much ice cream all at once. Your life is like fulfilled. You don't need any more cake and ice cream. So she passed away. So he was raised by a wet nurse who was his aunt. So the tigress was reborn as the aunt. And so the tigress basically wet nursed him throughout his infancy up until age 4 or 5 or however long they did in those days in India. Later, the tigress aunt gives a whole new meaning to the name Tiger Lady. The tigress lady went on to become the first Buddhist nun, the first woman to take monastic ordination in the Buddhist tradition. So all Buddhist nuns since then owe their spiritual lineage of ordination to her. And as for the 5 cubs, they were the first 5 disciples of the Buddha. So I wanted to tell this, and and as for the boy who gave his life to the tigress, I forgot to mention who he was. He was none other than Maitreya. And so that idea of the great sacrifice coming through in that way, Maitreya made that great sacrifice. So through that great sacrifice, Buddha gained the mother and father of his life, as the Buddha gained the wet nurse and gained the first 5 disciples who set his whole tradition in motion, and which has come down to us over the last 2,569 years. The number of years is debatable. We only say that because in 1956, Nehru and Buddhist scholars around the world said 56 was the 2,500th year. And so then in India, they held a great celebration. And Buddha said, 2,500 years after my passing, my Dharma will go to the land of the red man. And of course, the red man means Irish people. We have famous for our red faces. And there's lots, luckily for America, some Irish live in America, so it's also coming over to America, isn't it? And I don't have much time left here, so I'll just finish a few ideas I wanted to show. So according to this idea of the 2,500, Maitreya achieves enlightenment after the tiger episodes, and then he's got the destiny to become the next universal teacher of the planet. And so he's the one that in the East is known as the loving one, in the West we know as the Christ, and so forth. And so he's sort of seated quite happily. And when the Buddha took birth, Buddha used to sit on that seat, and he said, "Oh, my seat's vacant. We're looking for job applicants." Maitreya was drafted, so there's Buddha giving Maitreya in the chair, Maitreya in gold, giving the crown to sit and become the next. So from that time until today, for instance, whenever any Dalai Lama dies, it's said he goes into the presence of Maitreya for a few days or weeks, and they sit and chit-chat and said, well, I did this in your past, and you screwed up on this, you screwed up on that, so this is what you got to do next time around. In terms of Manjushri and Maitreya, the two great ones who I showed before, all teaching lineages in Dalai Lama school comes from them. On the left side, as you view it, is all the love teachings from Maitreya, and on the right side, all of the wisdom teachings from Manjushri. So those lines are the great masters of India through whom it was passed, and then in Tibet, and then down to the present day. Asanga was the one who brought many of the Maitreya teachings to highest crystallization in India. And so his famous 5 books of Maitreya are what all Tibetan monasteries of all schools study today, and which of course are mentioned by great masters such as the Tibetan and so forth. There he is, Asanga's unticketed flight when he flies up to rendezvous. And I just thought I would show the Maitreya tradition began as an artistic tradition with the Greek influence after Alexander the Great went to the East. And then the early Maitreya statues are all Gandhara, like this and like this. And then later in India, it goes down from Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, down into the deep south and becomes this sort of more cleanly shaven. Then goes to Korea with this kind of Rodin, the thinker kind of a look. And then goes over to, what is these people? Oh, yes, in Tibet. And the great Maitreya, the 26.3 meters Maitreya in Tibet, which the Sisterhood of the Blue Rose managed to experience. And then a little bit of Maitreya's heart has come to America. And I'm out of time. What? Oh, yes. Oh, maybe I can click over. Oh, no, I'll go back one. So this image here, which I've put on the stage, and I don't know if the camera's picking it up back there, but it's made by a very dear friend of mine in Washington, D.C., a wonderful artist who does digital art, and this is the Great Hall of Maitreya. So in this, he has shown the early Gandhara styles, and then the Gupta styles, and the other styles that developed around Asia. And in the front, he puts Maitreya, who I think looks strikingly like Michael Robin. Don't you think? If I think of Michael, like, had a little shave. A little shave. Yes, tie his hair on top. But anyway, my friend has been working on a series of female Buddhas, Taras, the 21 Taras, for the last years. And then he's been working on a group of Maitreya images that he thinks are very important spiritually for the planetary crossroads that we're at right now. And he made this, and this is gifted to Olivia, actually. But I didn't want to let her have it, so I kept it so I could use it tonight in my own presentation. She can have it only when I'm through with it. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And as I said in the afternoon, please, people, everyone, dedicate merit to one's own enlightenment for the benefit of all living beings, because we can't wait for everyone else to get enlightened first. We have to hurry up ourselves, and make a special prayer for the long life, health, well-being, and success of your own spiritual teachers. And of course, because this is a very special Sangha, for your own special teacher here, to dedicate that this good man lives for at least another 327 years.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.